Hello, 2-2 group. Here I am again. I just finished mowing the lawn, so I'm a little tired, but let's get through a very important battle. We last left off with Normandy, and then remember it took 2 months to punch out of that region. So it's not just the idea of landing, it's the idea of once you get on the beach, now where do you go? And it's about taking these strategic positions. The British are fixated on Caen, Caen. It's a town in France. And it's about controlling roads, basically, which is transportation. So how do I start with this battle? A lot of ways to do it, but I'm going to start with this. Do you like surprises for Christmas? The battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of the Bulge, and the shoe is literally on the other foot in this way. The Americans and the British have now extended themselves well past Paris, and they're in a nation called Belgium, and they've pushed the Germans back. And in doing so, the British are established on the north, and the Americans to the south, right near the Ardennes forest. A very appropriate place for a lot of reasons, and I don't want to get into too much into that. But now, as you move into December of 1944, the Americans and the Brits begin to relax, and they're extended along this very long line in a very thin way. And the belief is the Germans just don't have the capability to launch any kind of offensive. They believe it'll be a lot of delaying actions and kind of rear, of a rear flank, or excuse me, oh, I'm blanking now. Just mow the lawn. Remember, it's a little exhausting here now. But this kind of a delayed retreat formation, okay, is what they're thinking about. They don't think anything's going to happen. They're actually enjoying themselves. And then what's going to happen is Hitler is going to activate our friend, the guy we knew from Normandy, Rundstedt. He's going to bring him back. Rundstedt kind of retired, basically. And then he comes back. And Hitler is going to convince the German general staff to put together this plan to launch. And what he wants to do is the Brits are to the north and the Americans to the south. His idea is to divide them, punch through. And his goal is this race to the seas, what we call it. And the idea is to get to this port of Antwerp. And it's a blitzkrieg. It's a classic blitzkrieg maneuver of the Germans. And so the general staff's not too crazy about this. Let me just be honest with you. But Hitler rules the day in this case. And they actually put together a really decent plan when you look at it. And in fact, this is absolutely in reverse. And what I mean by that is, see if this sounds familiar. The Germans are going to use deception, okay, deceiving the Americans that where this is going to take place at. We're back to the issue of where, the issue of when. And so there are these signs that start to pop up. And the American military intelligence kind of pick up on it. They see it. Some of them don't put much significance to this. They don't see it as anything, major going to happen. And what has happened is the Germans have collected about 250,000 soldiers for this. And it's an amazing thing to read from that perspective because it's a motley group just kind of thrown together. But there's some real good veteran soldiers in there, and that's going to matter when we get to the end. Because this is the big finish. This is this big counteroffensive that's going to be launched. Finally, on December 16th, at 05:30, the Germans are going to launch this massive attack. It just erupts and opens up on the American and the British lines. Once again, the lines are very stretched out, very thin. It's called the Ghost Front in terms. And once again, I'm going to mention and give a lot of credit again to this guy named Ken Burns, who does this fabulous series called The War. If you don't get it, you got to get it. And he's got a segment in there called The Ghost Front. And it's one of the best you'll ever see, and the stories are amazing. Anyway, so now that this offensive is launched, Hitler is going to use one huge advantage. You got to give him some credit in this, and here it is: the weather. Sound familiar? Sounds normal. So here we got deception. We got the idea of the Germans massing up this huge amount, this huge army, and what they're going to do, this coordinated effort, and they're going to use the weather. Here we go. And so why the weather matters is it keeps the one thing out that is absolutely essential for the Americans specifically, and that's the air power. And so the planes can't get up. It's not favorable to them. So this puts ground-to-ground forces in action, and the Germans just punch out and punch through, and the Americans just reel back, okay? And so this is kind of the weather and the design of the winter being used as a cloak, and then the dagger are these panzer divisions, about 8 panzer divisions that are brought up. And these are these tiger tanks, as they're called, that are just coming out of the woods and out of these unbelievable, down these trails that the Americans are just flabbergasted and can't believe they're happening. The Americans are rolled back. Now what's going to happen, and why it's called the Battle of the Bulge, is this bulge is going to develop in the lines. Instead of this lines being like this, there's going to be this bulge that develops. Okay, and the bulge is really centered around 2 areas, but there's one that matters, and that's Bastogne, Bastogne. It's a small little town, but it sits where all these roads are connected to it. It's absolutely essential that the 101st Airborne hold on to Bastogne. One of the great lines, if you ever get into this, there's several, but one of the great lines is where the 101st Airborne is sitting there in Bastogne, and they say, they've got us surrounded. We got them right where we want them. You know, I mean, this is the idea of the 101st, because they're not in good situations, not in good shape. They're pretty isolated, and they're pretty much left alone. And what they have to do is hold Bastogne at all costs. This is a tremendous, tremendous battle. And sitting there in Bastogne is the commander of the 101st, last name McAuliffe, MC. Capital MC, capital AULIFFE. Now, if you ever get back to NMMI, we will all get back again anytime soon. His response to the Germans, okay, is on our wall, okay, in fact, right outside the world, where the World History Room is at. And what you have to understand is the Germans parlay. They say, okay, let's see if you want to surrender. And they drive in and they talk to McAuliffe. Just his answer is one word: nuts. And the Germans are kind of like, what's this mean? You know. And so what happens is, what it really means is, you know, go to hell. Okay. And he's saying, we're not going to do this. We're going to fight it out. And what's happened is as this Battle of the Bulge is raging on, you really see a tremendous amount of heroism. And the thing to look up is the use of the African American troops. And the army was heavily segregated, okay, as you should know. But now what happens at Bastogne, that ends for that period of time. And you have a large segment of the African Americans, the 333rd, all threes. 333rd is the one to look up, and also the 761st. These are infantry units, artillery units, excuse me, one of them is, and they're brought up, and they fight valiantly. They'll be highly recognized later on for this effort, and it's because of their throwing themselves into this battle that they help to stem this tide. The other thing that happens, though, is the Germans end up capturing a group of American soldiers in this place called Malmedy. It's to the north of Bastogne. And in Malmedy, you get this thing called the Malmedy Massacre. The Germans take these American prisoners, and then they kill them in cold blood. And this is not what's supposed to happen in the rules of war. It's supposed to be this POW systems in place. And this is just horrifying and shocking to the Americans. And this really surges the blood of the Americans. They're angry. They want satisfaction for this. The other guy that you have to fixate on, okay, besides these African-American groups, besides McAuliffe and the 101st holding on Bastogne, is Patton. And I told you Patton's finest, okay, to me was really early on in the war, because he's really helping to shape the idea of the tanks and the use of these vehicles that were really not that good at in the beginning. Here it is, and it pays off. The Third Army under Patton now absolutely makes a 90-degree turn and smashes into the left flank of the panzers from the Germans and helps roll this back for the Americans. The other thing that happens finally is the weather clears up. On December 22nd, 6 days later, if you can imagine being in Bastogne for 6 days like this, on December 22nd, the weather clears. And now with these nice blue skies, the air support comes in. The air support has 2 key things to it that's going to turn the tide. One, of course, they're going to be able to pinpoint where these tanks are, and they're going to start nailing them. The second thing is air support dropping supplies, and very, very necessary, because you have to understand this is not like, you know, some of the movies you see where the guy keeps shooting the gun and it seems like it has, you know, an endless chamber. Right? You have a clip, you know, with let's say 11, you know, or 9 rounds in it, and it seems like they've shot like 48 by the time you're done, you know, with the scene. This is not the case. Ammo does run out. Medical supplies do run out, as we know today. And so this is the idea. So hold on is really one of the things in Bastogne, and it's the courage and the tenacity of the American soldier that really comes through in this case. It's a good plan by the Germans. Okay, it's not bad at all. It's a very well designed system. 10,000 Americans end up being captured very quickly because this is kind of caught off guard. They had an idea what might happen, but it wasn't. Once again, it's kind of like Normandy. You're not sure where. You're not really clear on when. And once again, the philosophy was they could not launch this massive offensive and it worked the way Hitler wanted it to. This is Hitler's last gasp. This is it. Because as the Americans are going to hold Bastogne and then finally launch their own counteroffensive to this, under Eisenhower's direction, once again, you got to give him credit equally as well, of allowing Montgomery and the British to kind of have their way. He lets them loose. He lets Montgomery have his way with the 9th U.S. Army, lets him have control of it. Which is intriguing. I don't want to get into all the politics and all the different backgrounds of this and the personalities yet. It's for a different time, different story, something you got to read. The Russians are now coming in. The Russians have pushed, and they're pushing across the Polish regions. They're over in the river area known as the Vistula and the Oder. And now this is sealing Hitler's fate. It is closing him in. This vice is coming in. The irony is, whenever I hear that term, I always think of World War I. The Germans in this vice, okay, right? And so here it is, and this two-front war that Hitler wanted to avoid at all costs, he now has a two-front war, and it is now beginning to close in. It's not over by any stretch of the imagination. There's still some things to do. There's a race on, basically, between the Russians and the Americans and the Brits to occupy regions. They have all discussed the idea of total victory, unconditional surrender of Germany, but Hitler's time is pretty much up. Speaking of that, my time's pretty much up. And what I'm going to do is just record and post this, watch it at your own leisure. We'll get here when we get here. We're a little ahead. I'm a little ahead of you. And then I want to move you back to the Pacific. I want to get you into the final two battles of the Pacific, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. So here we are in December of 1944. We're going to move into January 1945 with the Russians moving into Germany. And I want to take you back out to the Pacific and get into Iwo Jima and Okinawa and complete that, and then begin to look at the idea of finishing the war in the Pacific. How is it going to end? And we'll talk about the dropping of the bomb or not. And by the way, I know I said time, but here we go. There's a guy I'd like you to look up, and his name is Paul Fussell, Fussell. And Paul Fussell wrote 2 books. He was a man who did something minor. I'm being, sarcastic here. He was, let me think, involved in the D-Day landings. He was involved in the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, so obviously he's in the breakout as well. Okay, of Normandy. Okay, and then for all of that sake, what are we going to do with Mr. Fussell? We're going to move him out in the Pacific so he can enjoy himself in Okinawa. And Mr. Fussell, because of this experience, went to school, the GI Bill, and he ended up getting his PhD in literature. And he wrote 2 very important books. One is on war, and he was a regular invited guest up to the West Point, up to U.S. Military Academy in West Point. And I think he understood war. And then the second book was Thank God for the Atomic Bomb. You can download it for free. It's a very short book. Mr. Fussell is no longer with us, unfortunately. But you guys have a good time. You be safe. Remember the tenacity of the American spirit in this case with the Battle of the Bulge. Here we are in our own battle. And please follow guidelines and orders like good soldiers should. And we'll all come home safe. We'll all be safe at home. However you want to flip that. Thank you. I miss you guys. Keep looking at your group email. You've got to look at your group email. Okay, take responsibility. Miss you guys. Bye.